This video is for entertainment purposes only, and it in no way serves as a binding contract between a landlord and tenant. This content may contain some material from your lease agreement. Use and occupancy. Any change in occupancy will require the written consent of the landlord and may be subject to an adjustment in the amount of rent. Rent. The rent due date is the date the landlord must receive the tenant's payment. Late fee. Payments received by the landlord when there are arrearages shall be credited first to any outstanding balance, and then applied to the current amount due. Security deposit. The tenant may be responsible for any unpaid charges or attorney fees suffered by the landlord by reason of the tenant's default of this lease, in accordance with state and local laws and regulations. Under no circumstance can the security deposit be used as payment for rent and/or other charges due during the term of this lease agreement. The landlord's recovery of damages will not be limited to the amount of the security deposit. Ending the lease. At the end of this lease agreement, or any renewal thereof, the tenant must vacate and shall immediately and peacefully surrender and return to the landlord the possession of the leased premises in as good condition as when tenant took possession, less normal wear and tear. The leased premises shall be cleared out of all occupants, furniture, personal articles, and effects of any kind. Utilities and services. The tenant agrees that landlord will not be held responsible for the loss of use, discontinuation, or interruption of any utility or extra services beyond the landlord's control. The tenant shall notify the landlord of any malfunction of a utility. Appliances. Tenant will keep appliances provided by landlord in good working order and shall report any malfunction to the landlord. Any damage sustained due to the neglect or misuse by the tenant will become the full responsibility of the tenant, either in the appliance repair or replacement. Tenant agrees he or she is responsible for any damage that occurs to the leased premises resulting from the addition of any appliance that is supplied by the tenant. Maintenance and repairs. If any required repair is caused by the negligence of the tenant and/or tenant's guests, the tenant will be fully responsible for the cost of the repair and/or replacement that may be needed. The tenant must keep the leased premises clean and sanitary at all times, and remove all rubbish, garbage, and other waste in a clean, tidy, and sanitary manner. The tenant is not permitted to paint, make any alterations, improvements, or additions to the leased premises without first obtaining the written permission of the landlord. The landlord's permission to a particular painting, alteration, improvement, or addition shall not be deemed as consent to future painting, alterations, improvements, or additions. Condition of property. The tenant acknowledges that the tenant has inspected the leased premises, and at the commencement of this lease agreement, the interior and exterior of the leased premises, as well as all equipment and any appliances, are found to be in an acceptable condition and in good working order. The tenant agrees that neither the landlord nor his agent have made promises regarding the condition of the leased premises. The tenant agrees to return the leased premises to landlord at end of the lease agreement, in the same condition it was at the beginning of the lease agreement. Rules and regulations. Vehicles parked on premises must be in working order with necessary registrations and/or inspections. Late fees are strictly enforced, and any unpaid fees will not be waived. The tenant may not interfere with the peaceful enjoyment of the neighbors. The tenant will be responsible for any fine and/or violation that is imposed on the landlord due to the tenant's negligence. The tenant shall abide by all federal, state, and local laws. The tenant shall notify the police and landlord of any illegal activity that is witnessed in or around the leased premises. The tenant agrees to test smoke detectors periodically, as well as maintain operational batteries at all times. The tenant must report any malfunction with smoke detectors immediately to landlord. The tenant agrees not to remove, dismantle, or take any action to interfere with the operation of any smoke detector installed on the leased premises. Absolutely no hazardous materials are permitted to be in or around the leased premises at any time. Charcoal and gas barbecue grills may not be used inside the leased premises. The tenant shall use ventilating fans at all times when bathing and cooking. All windows and doors must remain closed during inclement weather. The tenant shall notify landlord of any pest control problems. The tenant must notify landlord of any changes in employment. The tenant must obtain written permission to install a satellite system or antenna on or around the leased premises. The tenant may not store or park a recreational vehicle, commercial vehicle, or watercraft on leased premises without landlord's written permission. Tenant is not allowed to list the house on any short-term rental sites for any reason. Both landlord and tenant agree to update either party with change of email or phone number. Security not promised. The tenant has inspected and acknowledges that all locks and smoke detectors are in working order. Any provided fire extinguishers, security alarm systems, and/or carbon monoxide detectors have also been inspected by the tenant and are in sound working order. Tenant understands that, although the landlord makes every effort to make the leased premises safe and secure, this in no way creates a promise of security. Right of entry. Landlord and/or his agents, with 12 hours written notice, have the right, during the term of this lease agreement, to enter during reasonable hours, to inspect the premises, make repairs or improvements, or show prospective buyers and/or tenants the property. In the event of an emergency, landlord reserves the right to enter leased premises without notice. It is required that landlord have a working set of keys and/or security codes to gain access to the leased premises. 1. Tenants will not change or install additional locks, bolts, or security systems without the written permission of the landlord. 2. Unauthorized installation or changing of any locks will be replaced at the tenant's expense. 3. Tenant shall be responsible for any and all damages that may occur as a result of forcible entry during an emergency where there is an unauthorized placement of a lock. Abandonment. If tenant vacates the leased premises before the end of the lease term or renewal thereof, without written permission from the landlord may, at landlord's sole discretion, hold a tenant in default of this lease agreement. If the tenant fails to follow proper move-out procedures, tenant will be responsible for any and all damages and losses allowed by federal, state, and local regulations, as well as this lease. Landlord's remedies. If tenant violates any part of this lease agreement, including non-payment of rent, the tenant is in default of this lease agreement. In the event of a default, the landlord may initiate legal proceedings in accordance with local and state regulations to evict or have tenant removed from the leased premises, as well as seek judgment against tenant for any monies owed to landlord as a result of tenant's default. The tenant agrees that any expenses and/or damages incurred as a result of a breach of the lease agreement, including reasonable attorney's fees, will be paid to the prevailing party. The tenant agrees that any court costs and/or fees incurred as a result of a breach of the lease agreement will be paid to the landlord or the prevailing party. Joint and several liability. The tenant understands and agrees that if there is more than one tenant that has signed the lease agreement, each tenant is individually and completely responsible for all obligations under the terms of the lease agreement. Notice, the lease is an important legal document. You may have an attorney review the lease agreement prior to signing it. If the landlord fails to enforce any provision of this lease agreement, it will not constitute a waiver of any default, future default, or default of the remaining provisions. Time is of the essence in this lease agreement.